So, yes, this week there was a meeting of the G7 foreign ministers in Lübeck, which is a town in Germany. And the G7 countries are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, the US, and also the European Union is represented there as well. So it's a meeting of the countries which have basically the most wealthy countries in the world. I think it represents something like it's about $260 trillion of global wealth. So,
wow.
They're very powerful countries involved in this.
Hey, weren't there 8 countries? Wasn't it called the G8 at one point?
Yes, and that's exactly the question that I put to Frank Jordans, who's a correspondent for the Associated Press, who I talked to about the G7 ministers meeting in Lübeck earlier this week.
Indeed, it used to be the G8 until last year, when Russia lost its membership of this exclusive club because the other members felt that it wasn't appropriate to have Russia at the top table given its support for the separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. So they downsized to the G7. That's France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Britain, Japan, and the United States.
So all of these countries coming together, it was the foreign ministers meeting this week. What was the meeting about and what was discussed?
Well, the foreign ministers met ahead of the big G7 summit, which is going to take place in Bavaria in June. And they met in Lübeck this week because it gives them an opportunity to discuss international issues with their peers rather than have everything focused on the heads of government, which is what's obviously going to happen in June. They had a lot on their agenda. There's a lot going on in the world, conflicts in the Middle East, such as Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq. Then there's the conflict in eastern Ukraine, which the German foreign minister pointed out was only 2 hours away from Lübeck. And then they had issues such as Ebola to discuss, climate change, which has sort of slipped off the international agenda a little bit lately. Yes, another issue was the democratic transitions in Africa, such as the recent Nigerian election. And they also discussed maritime security, which was appropriate given that Lübeck back in the 12th to 14th century was a Hanseatic port city which was plagued by pirates. And the Hanseatic League managed to clamp down on that by sort of bundling together their efforts and cracking down on piracy in the Baltic.
So a very appropriate location then for this meeting. So lots of people get the impression that these foreign ministers come together, they have 24 hours together, and they go away. What possibly could they agree on in this time? Was anything agreed upon at the meeting?
Well, that's the thing. The G7 meeting isn't really a forum for making decisions about things. It's more an opportunity to discuss important issues and to decide which direction to move in, to formulate a common position. And that is basically what they did. The foreign ministers came out with a very long statement at the end in which they touched on several dozen points that they discussed. It is difficult to imagine that they really had in-depth discussions about all of these issues, but they will have had an opportunity to discuss several aspects of each of those issues and see whether there were perhaps things that one country or another felt very strongly about. And this is important when they then go back to their capitals and instruct their own diplomats on how to proceed at the United Nations, in the Security Council, in other forums where actual decisions are made, including at national level. So this was very much, let's call it a thinking retreat for the foreign ministers.
That's a very poetic way of putting it, Frank. Very good. So, bringing it back to Germany, are these meetings important for Germany? After all, the country has been taking more of a proactive role in foreign policy, as we've been seeing with the negotiations with the nuclear deal with Iran and in the Ukraine conflict recently.
Yes, I would say that they are important for Germany. This is just the kind of thing that the Germans love doing. They love organizing meetings, bringing people together for discussions, and showing the world that you can do foreign policy without going to war. They made a big effort. They put on an impressive show. This Lübeck event was very well organized, and it's hard to imagine that the big summit in Bavaria in June will be any less well organized.
So Germany's hosting the foreign ministers in Lübeck, or they already hosted the foreign ministers in Lübeck. Then there's the finance ministers in Dresden, and then there's the big summit in Bavaria in June. So Germany really is being very proactive this year. They have a lot on their diplomatic plate, let's say.
That's correct, yes. They've got the presidency of the G7, and with that comes the responsibility of organizing and hosting these meetings. But as is the case with some of these rotating presidencies, some countries take them more seriously than others. And Germany is certainly taking its presidency very seriously this year, and they also have a lot of important topics to discuss. So we can expect the G7 summit in June to be quite a big affair.
So what was your impression from being there?
Well, I'd never been to Lübeck before. It is quite a charming city, I've got to say. Very nice medieval buildings and canals running through the city. The venues were very good, and the whole event, as I said, was very well organized. A little bit frustrating for reporters, as these events always are, because the access is very limited. The organizers make sure that they feed journalists a steady sort of drip of statements, and occasionally you get to ask one foreign minister or the other some questions, but there's not much opportunity to chase diplomats down the hallways that you might have at the UN and such like. But nevertheless, it was a sort of compact 24 hours of reporting and not really disrupted much by protesters. The demonstrations were quite limited this time. I expect that to change in Bavaria in June.
And that was Frank Jordans, a correspondent for Associated Press, speaking to us there earlier in the week. You can find him on Twitter @WireReporter if you want more of his reporting from Germany and Europe.